North Dakota State Extension economist Frayne Olson is our grain market analyst this week. The USDA recently released its long-term projections for planted acreage until 2025. Under those assumptions, the amount of soybean acres farmers planted in 2015 would have been the most over the next 10 years. Total corn acres would be larger than 2015 in each year until 2024. Focusing specifically on next year, we talked with Frayne at the end of December to get his opinion on how acres will break down this spring.
Obviously, there's a lot of moving parts. A lot of the market analysts at this point that are trying to forecast acreage are really looking at the relative profitability of crops and trying to put themselves in the farmer's shoes, saying, well, what looks like it'll make you some money this year? And as I do that kind of calculation and that math process, again, there gets to be a lot of shifting. I don't know that we're going to see a large change in any one crop or any one area, but I do think there'll be some subtle shifts going on. I guess as I look into my crystal ball, I'm looking for a small increase in corn acreage. I do think the soybean acreage will be relatively flat, although that can be heavily dependent upon what happens in South America. I think that the wheat acreage, all wheat acreage, may be up just slightly, which is a slight difference from what USDA is looking at. And I do expect sorghum acres to be down.
Your corn and soybean projection, that would differ a little bit from what the USDA is suggesting, yes?
Yes, it is. And again, this is a matter of looking at relative profitability and what you think farmers will do. I guess one of the reasons I'm looking at a slight increase in corn acreage is because of the bump we had in sorghum acres in 2015. Which was really stimulated kind of on a short-term event because of the large exports that went into the China market. That China has changed some of their policies right now, and we're not importing nearly as much, or they're not importing as much sorghum from the U.S. as they did before. So sorghum prices have fallen fairly quickly. And we do have regions of Nebraska as well as Kansas and into Oklahoma that can flip between the sorghum and the corn acres. And so I do see sorghum acres dropping. I think some of those acres will flip into corn. As we get into the northern plains here, at least in North Dakota specifically, I do expect corn acres to be down in North Dakota. But again, when you look at regional differences, I think we'll start picking up some other acres in other parts of the U.S.
If you look back at how farmers changed their acres with record corn and soybean prices, how have farmers responded now that prices have fallen back?
Well, we've come off of unprecedented corn and soybean and wheat prices the last several years. Of course, the market was telling farmers we need more of these high-value crop acres to come into production. They started switching things around. We started pulling acres out of hayland. We started pulling acres out of some of the smaller market crops that we grow here in the northern plains. And we were able to find what we needed. Now, as we move into today's environment, you're absolutely right. As prices come down, some of those acres will more than likely shift back into some of those alternative crops. And people often forget how many acres go into annual hay production and how many acres go into alfalfa production. And that's pulling or competing with the higher valued or higher productivity land that we use for corn and soybeans. As well as, again, some of the smaller market crops. We have a lot of those up here in North Dakota. So as we look at total cropland acres, we had an expansion in the late 20-teens. I think we're going to see some of that expansion retract now. I do think we're going to see total cropland acres drop off as we move forward.
And you mentioned that Northern Plains region. You've said this before, that there are areas that are kind of a transition zone and can flip back and forth. Are those farmers starting to go away from some of the main crops and back to maybe what they would have grown years ago?
Well, I'm certainly getting a lot of questions. I've been traveling a lot the past month or so, going to a lot of different meetings, talking to farmers. They've got a lot of questions about, is there some profit opportunity in some of these smaller market crops, the crops that we grew 10, 15 years ago, or even sometimes 5 years ago, and looking at it and saying, well, we need to back off. The corn isn't as profitable as it used to be. We are in a transition zone. We're comfortable producing these crops. What's out there that might look like it may make a profit in 2016? And so there's a lot of questions going on. I do think we're going to see some of those corn acres, at least in North Dakota, be flipped to something else. Right now there's some profit opportunities in some of the pulse crops. Some of the minor oilseed crops look like they'll have some opportunities as well.
Let's talk about the January 12th reports, Frayne. There's a lot of meat on the bone that day. What are you looking for?
Well, there's going to be some major reports. We're going to have the winter wheat seedings report, which again will be important because that'll set the stage for how many acres of corn and soybeans are we going to end up with. We're going to have the quarterly stocks report, which is really important for the corn market because it's so hard to track feed usage, and that's kind of the only real measure we have for how quickly we're using the corn crop up. We're going to have an update for the WASDE report, which of course is always important, especially at that time of year, because we'll have a better read on what's happening in South America. And then finally, we'll have the official final production reports. So we'll get the final estimates, the official estimates for both yield and acreage for the 2015 production.
We're early, but do you expect any shocks?
Right now, I really don't expect any major shocks. I think the one that the market will be looking at the closest will be the WASDE report to try and get an idea of what's going on, in particular in the forecast for exports as we move forward in time. Probably the next most important will be that quarterly stocks report, because again, we follow that very closely to get a measure of what's the actual consumption within that block of time between reports.